said that you want to hear it. Thank you very much for letting us know. If you're one of the people that are sick of it, suffer.
The honest truth is that most bands are at their best on their first album, maybe their second album, but unfortunately it's usually downhill from there. Which is why I'm so fascinated by bands who do the opposite. For example, Ice Nine Kills, who took about 15 years to hit their prime, Falling in Reverse with Ronnie Radke now being 2 decades into his career and hitting new heights like every month, and the subject of this video, Motionless in White. The band turns 20 this year and yet somehow it feels like they're just getting started. Hitting 4 million monthly listeners on Spotify, top billing on tons of festivals, and collaborating with WWE, among many other accomplishments. And they're one of those rare bands that seems to appeal to pretty much every facet of the metal community. If you look at their fan base, you'll see everyone from sort of your average deathcore guy, to the goth TikTok e-girl, the casual butt rock guy, metalcore kids, like really pretty much every metal fan archetype you can think of. And the question is, how did they do it? How did a bunch of guys from a kind of small city in Pennsylvania go on to become one of the biggest metal bands of their generation? And what is their lasting impact? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, a little story. A couple years ago, a good friend of mine got his identity stolen, and let me tell you, it was absolutely awful for him. They ran up thousands of dollars in charges on his credit cards, and it took him forever to get it straightened out. Now, let me tell you about Aura, the sponsors of today's video. After witnessing what my friend went through, I realized how vulnerable so many of us are online, and that is why I use Aura. Aura alerts me when my data has been part of a data breach or leaked on the dark web, plus fast fraud alerts, and it removes my information from data broker websites. Plus, there's transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance, all in one app. And Aura is offering a 2-week free trial for my audience. You can go to aura.com/punkrock to access it. And if you think this kind of thing can't happen to you, think again. For example, Ticketmaster was recently hacked, and the data of 560 million users was put up for sale on the dark web. But if my information was compromised in the Ticketmaster data breach, I would feel a lot better knowing that I had Aura. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/punkrock and try your first 2 weeks for free. And that's also linked below in the description of this video. Motionless in White formed in 2004 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which you may know as the home of The Office, and named themselves after an obscure song by 18 Visions. And they pretty much hit the ground running. During their first couple years as a band, they immediately started touring and released a few EPs. The first one was The Horror in 2007. She whispers, and as the guys in the band would probably tell you, this is definitely a little bit rough around the edges, but at the same time, it does kind of have that like late 2000s charm to it. I kind of like it. And musically, you can kind of hear the traces of what they would go on to do in the future, but overall, I think it's closer to maybe something like Under Oath than anything else, which is obviously pretty different from what they're doing now. But with their second EP, When Love Met Destruction in 2009, this is where they started to sound a lot closer to what they would do on their first album. And shortly after that, they attracted the attention of Bob Becker at Fearless Records and got signed, which led to them releasing their debut album Creatures in 2010. And this got them a pretty good amount of attention in the metalcore scene right off the bat. They went from basically a local band to a fairly well-known national band very quickly with this album, and for good reason. For one, even though they certainly do sound different now, if you listen to it, this album is still essentially the core foundation of their sound. What they did is essentially take the whole like metalcore with synths kind of thing that Attack Attack popularized and put their own fresh spin on it. For example, instead of using the synths to do a dance part like Attack Attack and Asking Alexandria did, they used them to build up this kind of like dark, brooding atmosphere. Another thing is the image and aesthetic that they were going for. They were doing this sort of horror Halloween kind of thing, which at the time nobody else was doing in metalcore. Remember, this was like the height of neon cartoon monster merch. So the whole like horror thing was very, very fresh at the time. It almost felt like they got Tim Burton to sort of be their creative director for everything outside of their music. And of course, another factor for them getting all that initial traction is the songs themselves. They kind of managed to be like the best of both worlds, with some of the most accessible, catchy choruses in the genre, but at the same time having heavy parts that were heavier than a lot of other metalcore bands. It's the thing that every band says they're gonna do, like this is our most catchy but heavy album ever, only Motionless actually did it. And I think them not being afraid to go so extreme in either direction was really what made the band stand out at the time, aside from obviously the aesthetics. And even though they were getting a lot of attention off the back of that first album, they changed things up quite a bit with their next album, Infamous, in 2012. And this is the point where they really sort of transcended the confines of what you would think of as traditional metalcore. Not only was this their most commercially successful release to date, it also established them as one of those bands that's just not going to be put in a box. I mentioned before their ability to appeal to all these different corners of the metal scene, and I think this is where that started. They're one of those bands where they can combine things that are borrowed from other bands and other genres and put them all together into a new thing. And even though you're sort of aware of where those things may have come from, it still sounds unquestionably like Motionless in White. For example, on this album, they ramped up a lot of the industrial elements of their sound to the point where some parts really wouldn't feel out of place on a Rammstein song.
Take medication to be someone else, and we take off our clothes to pay for the bills.
Meanwhile, there's other parts like this that sound like something Slipknot might do. And aside from that, I think there's like a dramatic, noticeable improvement in just the overall songwriting. And so you put all that together and it was just overall better than the first album in every way. And this would continue on their next album, Reincarnate, which came out in September of 2014.
Crawling from hell, falling from grace.
And this was more or less a continuation of what they did on Infamous, just a little bit more polished and refined. It's definitely the most gothic thing they've ever done. So if your favorite aspect of the band is the Marilyn Manson, Tim Burton kind of stuff, then this is definitely up your alley. And even though it was the most heavy, pissed off thing that they had done so far, songwriting wise, I think it's also the catchiest, with choruses that put most of their peers to shame. And I was sort of watching them level up year by year by year, but to be honest, I didn't really pay that much attention to them until I saw something that really caught my eye and made me respect them in a whole new way, which was one of Chris's posts on Tumblr from around that time. And if you remember, this was the height of the whole like savior core thing with people like Austin Carlisle and Matty Mullins kind of positioning themselves as these inspirational figures that were here to save their fans, which on the one hand sounds cool, but there's something about it that just felt like very slimy and egotistical and like narcissistic to me. And in this Tumblr post, Chris basically put that whole thing on blast. 8 out of 10 bands, clothing lines, and public figures around now are on the inspirational message train. I've been watching it grow for the past few years. I can't see a band anymore without hearing the same regurgitated and hollow words come from their mouths. I haven't seen a clothing line released lately without the accompanying message in any variation the company decides to convey it. Do people not realize that they're being scammed? And there's even more than that, like he just completely went in on this. And I thought it was really cool that he said that. Number one, because I completely agree with it, but also because this was like a genuinely bold thing for him to do. Like he was going after a lot of people that at least at that point in their career were in bands that were bigger than Motionless. So I think taking a stand on this was a real risk to their career, but I really respect that he did it anyway. And overall, with Reincarnate, this is where they really cemented themselves as one of the most popular bands in the sort of overall metalcore Warped Tour scene kid kind of demographic. But they still hadn't quite hit that next level, which is to be one of those bands that's on the top bill of a lot of these major festivals that are sort of flirting with mainstream popularity. And that is exactly what happened with the release of their next album, The Graveyard Shift.
I'm ready to bury all of my bones.
And if you're around back then, you'll remember that metal was not in the best place around this time. The scene overall just kind of felt stale. There weren't really any new bands breaking through. It felt like a lot of the older bands were in a rut. Warped Tour was kind of on its last legs. And so we were really just kind of looking for any kind of signs of life. And so this is one of the few times where it felt like an event when a band this relatively young released a new album, and for good reason. For one, commercially, this was easily their most successful album to date, hitting number 9 on the Billboard charts, which was pretty crazy. I certainly never expected that from the band that put out Creatures only 4 years earlier. And that essentially took them from being a darling of the Warped Tour scene to being a major festival headliner kind of band. And musically, it was also their best work to date. Once again, the songwriting overall was just better than anything they'd done before. In particular, I think it's really impressive how varied the album is. To give you a few examples, if you're into Marilyn Manson, then a song like Rats might be up your alley.
Well, this is Father says, I insist, fix me up with something quick.
Or maybe you're just like the pure metalcore kind of person that's into All That Remains and August Burns Red, in which case a song like 570 will have you covered.
If you mean it, you will make it.
Or maybe you're the new metal guy, in which case the song Necessary Evil is for you.
But I won't die for you! It's my body and I'll die when I want to!
And this level of genre bending and playing with so many different sounds, while still managing to stay somewhat cohesive, I think that's something a lot of bands try, but the vast majority of them fail at it because just honestly, it's really hard. Because this is something where in order to pull it off, an artist has to have great songwriting chops and also a just sort of overarching umbrella creative vision of what is the common element that ties all these different things together so that it doesn't just sound like a jumbled mess of shit smashed together into one album. There's really only a few bands I think that can pull it off, for example, A Day to Remember or Falling in Reverse. And with this album, Motionless In White proved that they were also on that level.
Weight of morality and check it at the door. I'll show you the worst in me.
And coming off of the success of this album, something interesting happened a year later. One of the songs, which was a deeper cut from the album called Voices, didn't initially get much traction when the album was released, but a year later they released it as a single with a video to go along with it, and all of a sudden it became their biggest song to date. It currently sits at over 50 million views on YouTube and almost 100 million on Spotify, which really just kind of shows you the power of what can happen when you push a song as a single, even if it was initially overlooked. Something like that doesn't happen very often, but it's always cool to see when it does.
Voices in my head again, beating me in a war I can't win.
And after that, they would continue their upward trajectory with their next album, Disguise, which came out in 2019.
I found myself by losing hope.
And with this one, they pretty much picked off where they left off with the last album. So if you liked Graveyard Shift, well, you'd probably like this one too. Although one thing worth pointing out is that this one had a lot more nu metal influences as compared to the previous album.
Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. Shut up, shut up, shut up.
But what's even more interesting than that is the thing that happened with Voices on the last album happened again with this one. Again, almost a year after the album's release, the song Another Life got the same single and music video treatment after initially being just kind of another song on the album. And once again, it ended up being their biggest hit to date. It currently sits close to 200 million streams on Spotify and well over 50 million on YouTube. That's 250 million streams for a band that initially seemed like they were going to be just another one of the mini Warped Tour metalcore bands. I think it's kind of fascinating that this phenomenon happened back to back, and I don't really know why, but it was really cool to see.
But I hate that it seemed you were never enough.
And this song also kind of broke out of the overall metal scene and started to get on the radar of people who don't normally listen to the genre. It kind of cemented itself as the breakup song for a lot of people, which I thought was really cool because to me, one of the most impressive things that any artist can do is to reach outside that bubble of their core fan base who already knows them and get people to care about them based purely on their music that don't know anything about their history or their scene or any of that stuff. And soon after that, they released a standalone single called Time Bomb in 2021, which I think is very much in the vein of something like As I Lay Dying.
All my life I've been a cyborg. I just running out. Juxtapose me with my past self until I get to life.
And after that, in June of 2022, they released, at the time of recording this video, their latest album, Scoring the End of the World.
I pull the sun from the sky to freeze the future of time.
And in my opinion, it's easily the best thing they've done so far. For one, it's still as varied as ever, but they've also brought in a whole bunch of new influences. For example, the song Slaughterhouse featuring Brian Garris of Knocked Loose, which has like a lot of elements of hardcore, something where obviously they have some roots, like naming themselves after an 18 Visions song. But sonically, that's territory where they had sort of never really gone before, and so I thought that was really cool to see.
You made a deal with the devil in a bloodbath. Now there's a price on your head, feel the contract.
And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have a song like Werewolf, which has kind of a pop sensibility with vocal lines that almost like wouldn't really be out of place on a Taylor Swift song.
I can be honest, I can be human, I can become the silver bullet.
And with this album also being their most commercially successful to date, once again hitting the Billboard Top 40, they're really getting close to that level where you could almost start to think of them as a mainstream band. For one, they recently appeared on the WWE main stage, performing the theme song for Rhea Ripley, which, if you didn't know, is one of the biggest stars in WWE wrestling.
Rhea Ripley being played to the ring by Scranton, Pennsylvania's own Motionless in White.
And time will only tell if they're able to sort of break through that glass ceiling of true mainstream popularity. But if any band has the potential to do it, I think Motionless is one of them. Which brings us to the last question in this video. What is their lasting impact? And obviously it's too early to say because I think this band still has a long, bright future ahead of them. But let's talk about what they've done so far. For one, I think they're one of the main people who brought that like Halloween, Tim Burton kind of aesthetic back into alternative music, which has obviously become a huge trend among other metal and alternative bands, like everybody from newer artists like Kim Dracula to people who've been around a little bit longer like Ghostmane, who hasn't put out music in a while but still is one of the biggest names in sort of the alternative music space. Another thing is that while their music is definitely great and it's gotten better and better with every album, I think they've shown the power of what happens when you put just as much effort into the aesthetics and packaging around the music. Like they put just as much energy into their music videos, image, and overall marketing as they do into their music. This sort of flies in the face of this idea in the metal scene that your success should be determined purely by your music alone, which I find funny because that's never really been the case in metal. You look at everybody from Slipknot to Kiss to to Limp Bizkit, and the through line for all of that is like really strong visual aesthetics. And Motionless is a band that clearly understood that from the very beginning. But I think maybe their biggest contribution is that they were one of the early pioneers of a thing that you see now, which is bands going in the extreme in seemingly opposite directions. For example, if you listen to a band like Spirit Box or Sleep Token, they either go full on pop or like full on deathcore levels of heavy. And yet it totally works, which is very different from the standard of what came before, which was for bands to be like kind of heavy but not really heavy, and like kind of pop but not quite pop. Everyone wanted to just sort of play it safe right down the line, and then bands like Motionless come along and say, no, you can go super extreme this way, super extreme that way, and it still works. You don't have to split the difference. That's something they did way back in 2010 on Creatures, and it's something that still is a trademark of theirs to this day. And with that being said, I have no idea when they'll decide to hang it up. Certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be anytime soon because they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger without any signs of slowing down, but who knows? All I know is that if they continue on the path that they're currently on, I think that we're going to look back on them as one of the absolute greats of their generation. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and also I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos early. I do giveaways and Q&As sometimes. There's also a way to have me review your music, so if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.